Welcome back to the Masters of the Universe Classics Director's Commentary with your host, me, Scott ToyGuru Neitlich, the former brand manager for pretty much all of this line. I mean, like 95% of it. Today we're talking about this guy. Who is this guy? If you are a casual fan or you're not a super hardcore fan, you may have no idea who this character is. This is the Faceless One, a character from the 2000X Mike Young series. And he was one I was very excited to get into the Classics line, not only because he was going to just make a really cool looking action figure, but he was also very much tied into kind of the core families and histories of Masters of the Universe lore. He was generational, both in the sense of his tie, but also he went back centuries. He was like a very old character who was around in King Grayskull's time. And he was another 2000X character, which, I'm a huge fan of that show. So you may see on the back of the package here, noting his real name as Nicholas Powers. And I'll get a bit more into his background in a moment, but I wanted to address that one to kick things off. So this name actually comes in a way from the Michael Halpern story guide that Mattel commissioned previous to the Filmation series in order to build out the world and basically get the brand ready for Filmation to do their take on the brand. And Michael Halpern wrote like a 20-page bio of the whole world. And one of the things he had in this was Eva Lynn. Her real name was Evelyn Powers, and she was one of the astronauts that came with Marlena from Earth. So Evelyn Powers, aka now Evil Lynn, was recast in Michael's Bible as an Earthling. That was eventually dropped, as was the name Evelyn Powers. But in my attempts, I guess you could say, to kind of make everything count, even though she was no longer going to be an Earthling and a fellow astronaut, to kind of provide a nod to Michael Halpern's Bible, I used Evelyn Powers as Evil Lynn's real name on her bio. So when she was reimagined into the 2000X series, the Mike Young production that came out right before Masters of the Universe Classics, I wanted to not only just keep that name, but she was now basically had her bio expanded, her timeline expanded, so you now actually met her family and kind of knew a little bit more about her background. And specifically by that, the Faceless One, if you haven't picked up from the visual cues of both of their outfits, are related. Well, okay, this visual cue doesn't help as much because in the vintage line she had bright yellow skin and a blue outfit. But in the 2000X series and in the Filmation series, she was wearing an outfit that was much more close. There we go, to the Faceless One. This is actually her 2000X figure, not Classics, but you can see how well they match up. And that's because Eva Lynn is the Faceless One's daughter. Dun, dun, dun. For people who are not, super fans and, more casual, that may come as a big surprise because we've never learned about Eva Lynn's family and past before. And it was one of the really cool things about 2000X. So how did the Faceless One get to be the Faceless One, even though he clearly does have a face? It's kind of ironic. The short story, he was basically cursed by the elders of Eternia for betraying them back in King Grayskull's time. There's a whole episode about it in 2000X if you want to see all of the details. But they essentially took away his humanity and turned him into kind of an immortal, ghosty kind of figure who has to stay at home and never leave. And even though he is called the Faceless One, he still has kind of a bit of a face. So one of the important parts about him is he's the guardian of this, a magical object called the Ramstone, which becomes the MacGuffin in a couple of episodes of 2000X. Now, from a toy perspective, I love doing magical objects. I love doing talisman and the MacGuffins from the different episodes, like King Grayskull here with the power orb, or we had Procrustes, who we haven't gotten to him in the director's commentary yet. We will soon, and he comes with the Star Seed, which is at the center of planet Eternia. It's like the main power source that gets hidden there. It's a whole other story. But the point is, making these cool magical objects and these MacGuffins in the toy line also again like Marzo's amulet, was one of my favorite things to do because I love when toy lines have the objects from the content, from the animation. I think it makes play cooler, it makes the toys cooler, and getting to do the Ramstone was actually, I guess if you will, the reason I wanted to do the Faceless One as a figure so quickly, because it meant we got to do the Ramstone. I was more excited about doing the Ramstone, I guess, than doing the figure. Not that the figure isn't cool, but I really love the Ramstone and the way it worked in the show. And this is actually a prop replica some fans made, I want to say at PowerCon a couple years later. But it's one of the cooler MacGuffins of the show, and that's because also visually it really ties into core Masters of the Universe visuals with the ram horns, and we'll get into that in a moment. Skeletor uses it, shocker, to try to break into Castle Grayskull like he does in almost every episode, because the Ramstone has the ability to, basically ram things. He creates this giant energy ram and tries to smash down Castle Grayskull's drawbridge with it. And I think eventually it takes the combined power of the Masters and the Sorceress to drive him back. But the Ramstone itself is like an ancient Eternian object, and even fans have written an entire bio just of the object. It comes from a city over in the dark hemisphere of Eternia. If you have your map, you can check it out. You will see on the Eternia map, the very first one we did, the ruins of Zalatia down there at the bottom of the Dark Hemisphere. And that's because in He-Man's time, or in the time of King Randor, as it says on the map, Zalatia was buried in the sand, and it was a sort of forgotten, long-lost city, kind of like the Roman Empire was in the Middle Ages of Europe. A symbol of a time gone by when there were other great cities, just sort of sitting out there. And again, you will notice the giant ram motif with the skull and the horns. Now, if you look on the pre-Eternia map, which shows what Eternia looked like in the time of King Grayskull, you will see also Zalatia in the same place, but as a full city. So here it is in a flashback episode with King Grayskull when he's visiting the city, and you could see that same giant ram that's sitting in the desert is now elevated above the city, and you could see much more of how grandiose the city is. It's not just, one, ram head sitting there in the sand and in the dust. So this is sort of Zalatia in its prime. And if you haven't connected the dots yet, you will note that our favorite main baddie of Masters of the Universe, Skeletor, has a ram-headed staff. And you might go, that's interesting. I'm seeing a ram motif going on here. What's up with that? Well, that's because the 2000X series, one of the things it really did well was it expanded on existing MOTU visuals and lore, and it gave a background to Skeletor's Havoc Staff and where it came from. So it was obviously a magic object from Zalatia. Zalatia. You can see in one of the mini-comics, we actually deliberately told this story where you have Keldor, as in pre-Skeletor, going to the ruins of Zalatia and confronting the Unnamed One, who has the staff. And Keldor is basically like, I've come for your staff. And the Faceless One is like, yes, I know, but you can't have it. So, of course, they get into a big magic-on-magic battle, which are, the best kind of visual battles to show. And during the course of them throwing magical energy at each other, Keldor winds up behind the Faceless One and kind of tries to grip him in one of those WWE, can you smell what the Rock is cooking moves. And when he makes physical contact with the Faceless One, it triggers in the Faceless One his, both past and future memories, where you see him seeing that Keldor is going to be the father of his grandchild by, marrying or being with Evelyn, and then that grandchild is going to get sent into the future and is going to wind up wielding the Havoc Staff, and this is sort of fate. So this vision of the past and the future, when he makes contact with Keldor, convinces the Faceless One that he needs to voluntarily give up the Havoc Staff to Skeletor, or Keldor, if you will, at this point. And So yeah, here you see his grandson Skeleton wielding the Havoc Staff in the not too far-flung future. But and we actually did get to this panel too, which is cool, because this panel that started as a flash forward was actually seen in a later mini-comic actually within continuity, which is awesome. I love getting to do that. So he voluntarily gives up the Havoc Staff, gives it to Keldor, and he now realizes that, Eternia is now his because he's got the power. The Havoc Staff will give him increased magic, etc., etc. All right, so not to go too much on about the Havoc Staff, you could already get it with the basic Skeletor figure. So if you had Skeletor, and most people started their collection with him, had a Havoc Staff. And I definitely wanted to make the one with the Faceless One different and unique. So we did that by casting it in iridescent plastic and then just painting the front half. And this gave it the effect that it was lit up and that it was on fire, which also got its very own bio from fans online later on. So yeah, that was basically the history of the Havoc Staff and why we wanted to make it different for the Faceless One, so that way you had kind of like an energized, lit up version. And it was sort of the idea that the Faceless One knew how to tap into more energy than Skeletor did, like it was his weapon, and like, he knew its secrets better. But obviously you could give this version to Skeletor and give him a powered up Havoc Staff. But the idea of having it come with the Faceless One was really to show that the Faceless One was more powerful and truly knew how to use this weapon. Now, the Faceless One obviously wasn't just loved by me, it was loved by lots of fans. And in fact, he got a whole comic book and a whole extended story from the MVC Creations Masters of the Universe comic book in issue 5. And in that one, they kind of showed a bit more of his background and what his face looked like before it was taken away and replaced by a featureless white kind of blobby face with dark eyes. It's like a faceless one without a face. Basically, Nicholas Powers here, taking his last name from Evelyn Powers, obviously, has just kind of more of a human face with gray hair. And even some fans did custom versions of the figure by sculpting this face. This was not something we had the tooling for at the time, but a lot of fans did want to give the Faceless One his actual face and do him as Nicholas Powers before he was cursed. That's really cool. That's what Classics is all about. Another cool thing about this figure was the way the cape worked. It was this really big overlay on the body. And when you took it off there, you can see it was just the basic buck cast in black to create kind of that shadowy effect. But it worked really well. And the Horseman, by using the combination of black parts and this very big overlay cloak, created a very unique, look for the figure where, it looked like he was kind of almost formless and coming out of the cloak. And they really nailed it. It was a really cool way of pulling the figure off. And, again, I got to applaud them. And, it was his first figure ever. And who knows if he'll have another one. But it was great to bring him into Classics. It was great to have the Ramstone. And he added cool magic elements. He added cool lore and, his tie to Evelyn and Keldor and the future and the past. And that's why he's such a great figure and a great character. All right, Nicholas Powers. From Michael Halpern's Evelyn Powers. There you go. See, the name, everything counts. Everything gets used. Hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll be back with more director's commentary before you know it. Thanks for watching.